All right. Quinn has been an awesome member here at the Midwest BDC. He is leading also our QAP Housing Working Group. Like I said before, he is a policy analysis at Elevate, a nonprofit organization designing and implementing programs that reduce costs, protect the environment, and ensure the benefits of clean and energy efficient use reach everyone. In this role, he researches industry conditions and can assist with the development of policy positions and advocacy materials, while also tracking multi-party coalition decisions, state and federal legislations, and regulatory proceedings. With this knowledge, Quinn is responsible for drafting grant reports, board reports, presentations, regulatory documentation, and other deliverables. He also represents Elevate at policy forums, conference calls, and events to develop, support, and maintain relationships with external stakeholders and internal customers. Through a working partnership with the National Strategic Engagement Team, Quinn also works with the Wisconsin Climate Table. Okay. The Illinois and Missouri Energy Efficiency for All coalitions. And I'm sorry, I'm scrolling down. I'm trying to get it all in there. And the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition as the representative from Elevate's policy department. He currently co-leads the Midwest BDC QAP working group and truly appreciates the opportunity to work with so many kind and intelligent people who work hard to fight for their communities and the planet. He lives in Chicago, and in his free time, he is training for his second marathon. He loves going to places and finding great food, which is a big part of the reason he does all this running. So we're going to welcome Quinn in, and I'm going to allow him to share his screen. But thanks so much once again, Quinn, for doing all the awesome work. And in his bio, he does exactly everything in his bio. I can attest to that.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right? Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Marnice. That was quite the introduction. I don't know that I deserved all that, but let's get right into it. And can everyone see my screen okay? It's the other important part of this. Fantastic. So yeah, two quick things that I just want to point out. One is that Marnice mentioned, as part of the norms here, reducing jargon. So if you hear me say anything that you don't immediately understand, please let me know, because the purpose of this toolkit is to break down the barriers to this QAP commenting process that we're going to talk about here in a second. And so as a part of making that accessible is using language that's accessible. So please let me know, but I'm going to proactively do my best to make sure that everything is understandable to anyone, regardless of your degree of familiarity with this. And then the other thing that Marnice mentioned is that we are all teachers and we are all learners, which is absolutely true here as well. And we all come to this from different perspectives. And that's actually, in addition to what makes just about every space, better, is diverse perspectives. This one is no exception. So, with that, we'll get right into it. This is my introduction slide, and we've done plenty of that already, but I'll just mention that the purpose of this toolkit is to help folks get more familiar with the process of getting involved with the QAP and submitting comments, regardless of how familiar they are with what that is or how to do it. I, as a policy analyst, am a member and for the past year have been co-leading the QAP and Affordable Housing Working Group for Midwest Building Decarbonization. which I'll refer to as Midwest BDC from now on. But in leading that, there are, like I said, some diverse voices that have made our comments stronger by having people come to it from different perspectives. And one of the ways that comments can get even stronger than that, and the ways that we can improve our comments even further, is by making sure that this process continues to get more accessible. And so that was sort of the impetus behind this toolkit. It was to help folks understand this process and how to get more involved and get more community voices involved in housing policy. Because I truly believe that the more community voices are involved in housing policy, the better it will be. So that was the inspiration of the toolkit. Let me get into some background behind the process, and we will get going. So let's see. This all started, this whole process all began with the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Not anything particularly exciting, but it did sort of get the ball rolling because the goal of the Tax Reform Act was to encourage developers to build and rehabilitate low-income housing units, which is a noble goal. And the method that they were trying to do this by was create sort of a competition for federal funding. So it's one thing to provide federal funding for low-income housing units, but having, sort of in the traditional capitalistic way, having developers compete for those federal funds by putting forth their own projects and improving their own projects. That was the way that they sort of determined that this would work. And that federal funding comes in the form of low-income housing tax credits, or LIHTC. So if you hear LIHTC, or if you see that acronym, that stands for low-income housing tax credits. And essentially the important thing to know with that is that's just the form that the federal funding takes, and it's what's used to subsidize their projects. So these developers that are interested in developing low-income housing will compete for those tax credits because they help to fund their projects. And so those low-income housing tax credits, or LIHTC dollars, are currently the largest source of affordable housing financing in the United States. And according to HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, LIHTC, or low-income housing tax credits, are responsible for 46,000 projects and 3 million units being put into service between its inception in 1986 and that's through 2015 for that statistic. So the way that this works is the Department of Housing and Urban Development sets national affordability requirements. So that's basically saying there's a certain rent that is considered affordable according to that department, and any project that is interested in pursuing these dollars has to adhere to those affordability requirements. Then the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, allocates respective tax credits to housing finance agencies, or HFAs. There are housing finance agencies in every state, plus New York City, Chicago, and several entities in Minnesota. And so basically the IRS is going to every year allocate certain tax credits to each HFA. And then this works out really well because every state then gets to create their own application process and criteria to decide which projects receive funding and how much funding they get. So that criteria is what the QAP is, and QAP, that's another acronym that's going to be thrown around a lot, but it basically stands for Qualified Allocation Plan. So all a QAP is when HUD and the IRS send money, these federal dollars, to states, plus New York City, Chicago, and some entities in Minnesota, for reasons that I'm not going to get into, but when those national departments send money to states, states get to decide how to distribute it. And the way that they decide how to distribute it is this QAP. It's the criteria that they use to decide which projects get funding and how much. And so it can be up to us, and I've got this sort of diagram here to help understand that relationship. So feel free to take a look at that. But it's basically a process that communities have a real opportunity to get involved with. And so I'll kind of mention that actually on the slide after this, but a couple of national and state requirements. The federal law requires that a QAP, a qualified allocation plan, gives priority to projects that serve the lowest income households for the longest period of time, or that remain affordable for the longest period of time. So that's like a very good tenet of this process. Preference is also given to projects that are in qualified census tracts or difficult development areas. A couple other acronyms for you, but only so long as they can contribute to a community revitalization plan, which some municipalities have. So that's just kind of a caveat there. But again, states, cities, and entities that receive these LIHTC dollars, they have the flexibility to decide what priorities and what requirements projects have to demonstrate to get the dollars. And the way that they come up with that criteria is we have the public has direct access to in the form of a commenting period, which we're going to get into here in a second. But basically, the other part of this law is that those entities, when they're distributing those funds, they have to be clear in communicating what their priorities are. And I will sometimes get the question, so Quinn, are there any specific requirements that states have to include, or can they just include any requirements that they think? And the answer to that is yes, there are 10 criteria that they have to address in each QAP, and they are these: project location, housing needs and housing needs characteristics. So sort of what does that community, what are the needs in that community? Project characteristics. So is there a community revitalization plan? And how does the project integrate with existing housing? Sponsor characteristics. So who are these dollars going to? Who's overseeing these projects? Tenant populations with special housing needs. So are there particular populations out there that have special housing needs that need to be addressed? Public housing waiting lists. So if there's a big backup for public housing, then a lot of times the next best option for folks that are waiting on that on public housing is affordable housing. And so addressing that backlog is something to take into consideration. Households with children, projects for eventual tenant ownership, which is one of my favorite concepts listed here. Basically, there are certain housing configurations that are essentially rent to own and can lead to collective ownership of a building, which is very cool to kind of put the power back in the hands of the people that actually live there. The energy efficiency of the project. So that's kind of the big one for us at the folks interested in energy efficiency and decarbonization. So number 9 is kind of our big one. And then the historic nature of the project as well. And that's usually goes for either rehabilitation projects or new construction projects in a historical district. So that's kind of the background. The next important thing to get into, and I kind of just want to make sure that I drive this point home because a lot of that is pretty boring and may not sound that important, but let me emphasize how important it really is. So anyone can submit comments to their HFA that basically your comments are going to be recommendations saying, hey, low-income projects that receive federal money, I want them to do this, or I want those projects, to be built with certain features or certain standards, by certain standards. And so when you influence that criteria, that can really change or have an impact on the amount of affordable housing, which, as we all know, or as some of us might know, the amount of affordable housing has a direct effect on the cost of affordable housing. If there's not that much housing and there's a lot of demand for it, that drives cost up because landlords can say, hey, I can charge more and someone will still live here because more and more people want this, versus if there's a greater supply, that is a cost control in and of itself. It also obviously influences the quality of the affordable housing. So, everyone deserves to have quality affordable housing, and oh, here, let me go back. And so, basically getting involved in this process and saying, yeah, we'd like it to be built to a certain standard or have certain quality inspections or certifications. Those can be included in the criteria as well. Also importantly, I think part of the cool thing about this process is, there's no national QAP, right? There's just state QAPs. So while it gets a little bit more complicated in that way, it's also kind of great because every state is different, every community is different and has different needs. And so the QAP and that exists in Hawaii is going to have to be much different from the one in Illinois, from the one in Maine, from the one in Washington State, from Michigan. All around, they're going to have different QAPs because those communities have different needs. And so we as members of the public and as advocates can ensure that housing developments meet the needs of our communities through this process. And this interaction can be very, very impactful, both positively and negatively. And just to give you an idea of kind of the impact that it can have and give you some real examples of positive and negative effects. So negative effects, I kind of wanted to do a side-by-side here with negative and positive effects to show you the difference. Few or ineffective efficiency and green building standards, fossil fuel powered heating and appliances, unsustainable or toxic building materials, which as anyone who's dealt with lead or even flooring, there's all kinds of building materials that can be toxic or unhealthy or unsustainable. Sprawling or disconnected housing, continued segregation and gentrification. As we all know, one of those components of QAPs that they have to take into consideration is location. And that's because without public intervention and housing policy, low-income housing can become concentrated in certain areas. And as we know, that kind of segregation can have huge impacts and huge harms if cities are already segregated, and if that segregation is further exacerbated, that can just further that harm. And then food deserts and limited access to educational options. So food and education are two things that, as we all know, have a direct effect on our prosperity as individuals, as families, and as communities. And so the sort of positive side of this, if we do get involved and if we are sort of active in where and how much and what quality of low income housing is in our community, we can ensure that those developments are walkable, bikeable, and connected to public transit, which I'm going to do a shout out to Ohio because they do that pretty well in their QAP. Resilient, built with sustainable and healthy materials, which is super important to the safety and the health of their occupants, their residents. Green building certifications, which I'm going to shout out Michigan. They do a really good job with incentivizing green building certifications. Electric readiness and electrification, which Illinois has taken steps towards, either promoting electric readiness or requiring it in some cases in new construction, making sure that we're building, if someone's building a new housing development, making sure that it at least is ready to be electrified as a new housing construction, rather than continuing to build housing that only operates on fossil fuels that is expensive to convert and retrofit into all electric, which is counterproductive. And then QAPs can also do a great deal in terms of, as I mentioned before, addressing racial and economic segregation. Right now, the state of Michigan and actually the Housing Finance Agency, the HFA in Michigan, is conducting a racial equity impact assessment. So they have a whole separate process that they've initiated to say, hey, how are these housing developments affecting racial equity and economic equity? And they're doing that in Michigan. And that's something that I think every state should be doing, because as we know, this country has a racist history that is inextricably linked with our housing policies. In terms of redlining, and that's a whole nother webinar. But and then lastly, making sure that these developments are connected to good schools and grocery stores, and that there aren't food deserts and places where folks, if they're in low income housing, that they aren't cut off from healthy food and good schools. So as you can see, this makes a big difference, and it's really something that everyone should get involved with, no matter what sector you come from, or what perspective you might have. So if I've done a good job at now convincing you of why you should get involved, your next question might be, well, when, and what's the process like? And so the way that this works is, as I sort of spelled out the background to, every housing finance agency receives these low-income housing tax credits, the LIHTC dollars, and they receive them every year. However, QAPs are not necessarily redrafted every year. So some are, I believe, Missouri, Indiana, and I think Wisconsin, if my memory serves me, are states that will redraft their QAP every year, every time to get those new dollars. But on a lot of places, I would actually say in most places, it's biannual. So they are allocating these dollars every year, but they're redrafting that criteria, they're redrafting that QAP every other year. And it also can happen at any time of the year. So there's not a QAP commenting period season. It can happen in the spring, in the fall, in the summer, in the winter. So it's very important to keep track of when commenting periods are, how long they are, because commenting periods there's no requirement for their duration, and I'll get into that in a second. But what is required is that HFAs provide a draft QAP. So anytime that they are proposing a new QAP, they have to suggest or put forward a proposed QAP and hold a public hearing. Those are both legally required parts of the process. Sometimes an HFA will release what I call a changes document. Basically a document that says, here's what we've changed from the last QAP to this one. But that is not required. It's a very helpful thing. And if your HFA does that, thank them because that makes the whole process a lot easier, knowing what's changed. But at the same time, maybe double check and verify that the changes that they say that they made are actually the ones that they made. And, you know, if there are, put it this way, if there are differences in their draft QAP that are not captured in their changes document, that's something you might want to look for, because that can happen intentionally and unintentionally. So I'm not even proposing that would be malicious, but it's, you know, sort of our due diligence. And then we as community members and as advocates have these recommendations for how we want to make the QAP better. And you're probably already thinking of a few right now. And the way that those recommendations are packaged is just formal comments. And we'll talk about like sort of how those are formatted. But those formal comments have to be submitted during a commenting period. That commenting period is usually 3 to 4 weeks, but not always. It can be longer, shorter, and sometimes they are announced beforehand. So sometimes an HFA will say, hey, everybody, we're going to have our commenting period. It's coming up in the spring. Keep an eye out. But sometimes, and I'm going to hold back on dragging any states that don't do this, but some states will just say, hey, commenting period starts now, and folks have to be ready. And so part of this process that I want to drive home is that folks are ready for that when it comes, and being familiar with this process will help with that. So here is a very, very helpful document that I developed as part of this toolkit. This toolkit, I'm sure Midwest BDC is going to make this accessible to publicly accessible to everyone. And you will find in the toolkit this state QAP tracking document, which I've created as part of it. And as you can see, the 8 Midwestern states plus Chicago are listed here. Those are the 8 Midwestern states that are part of the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition's territory. So I've got those 8 states plus Chicago listed. Their housing finance agency, sometimes called a housing development authority. Those are listed and also linked to their websites. The last QAP that they've released and a link to that document is included. The last QAP commenting period that they had, so knowing when that commenting period was sometimes gives us an idea of, hey, it might happen again this time next year, or this time in the year following. Not that it has to, but it, you know, anything that can give us a good indication of what might be coming is always helpful. The term cycle, so like I mentioned before, a lot of these states, they redraft their QAP every other year, but Indiana, Missouri, and Wisconsin are the 3 that are redrafted every year. And I'm smiling because I think I got that right when I mentioned it before. And then, very importantly, perhaps most importantly, is the last 2 columns, the next draft release. So a lot of times an HFA will say, here's when we're expecting our next draft to come out. They don't have to do that, but a lot of them will, because a lot of them are trying to be inclusive and include people and make sure that they know when things are coming up. And so, as you can see, 2023, we've got a lot of stuff coming up, especially in the spring. 5 of the 8 are coming up in the spring, and almost all of them are coming up at some point this year, with the exception of Minnesota, because Minnesota was last year, and we, Midwest BDC, as a coalition, well, the QAP working group, I should say, developed some really, really great comments that I've gotten a number of compliments on, that I don't accept those compliments on behalf of myself because it was really a group effort. But I'll be sharing some examples from the Minnesota QAP just because that was the most recent one that we got that were very high quality comments that there's a lot of good examples from. And then finally, the typical commenting period, which, as you can see, almost every case, 3 and 4 weeks. The only state that is an exception to that is Missouri, and I've been submitting comments to Missouri for a number of years now. And if anyone's listening from Missouri, please change your commenting period. It's 3 days long, and that is not inclusive. It's one of those things where an agency will adhere to the law up until the point where it stops, and there's no sort of requirement about how long it needs to be, and 3 days is not enough to be inclusive and to be equitable and to give people a fair chance to participate in this process. So Missouri, shame, we know your name. Fix that, please. And then so now you should have a good sense of the background, a good sense of why we should all be involved in this process and why it's important. And now we know when we can do that. So the next huge question, and sort of the meat and potatoes of this presentation, is how to draft and submit comments. And there are 8 easy steps that I've put together to basically walk everybody through the comment creation process. So let's get into those. So step 1, gather partners. So this is a hugely important step. I was about to say the most important step, and I'm deciding that I will say that. It is the most important step to have a diverse coalition where everyone has an equal seat at the table and an equal voice. You want a coalition of diverse partners, including environmental advocates, housing experts, engineers and architects, building code and technical experts, community leaders, community members, and developers. Because, all of those people, like I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, come to this work with a different perspective and a different area of expertise. We're all teachers, we're all learners. Community members know more about their community than a lot of other folks do, right? But I'll just say housing experts and building code experts and experts in any field, obviously they know about that field. But then you've got community members and environmental advocates that are going to know more about their community and know more about the impact that housing will have in that community and in that environment better than some other folks. And so having that diverse coalition is what's really going to strengthen your comments, so that you can kind of have everyone contribute to that, to the recommendations. And so, like a lot of things, having people from different backgrounds makes everything better. Some states have an energy efficiency for all coalition. I am a member of Illinois and Missouri's energy efficiency for all coalition, or EFA coalition, if you've heard that before. Those coalitions tend to be plugged in. I know that I actually know for a fact Illinois and Missouri have EFA coalitions that I'm a part of, and then Michigan and Minnesota also have EFA coalitions. And so I encourage you to get in touch with them, and specifically for this process, they're a good sort of partner coalition to be in contact with, because they are aligned in a lot of the same values. So working with them to submit comments or to join in theirs, or just collaborating, is that there's opportunity for that. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention too is, when you have a diverse coalition of partners, there is going to be some negotiation, right? There's going to be some compromise that has to happen. When you've got developers in the room at the same time as community members, what is in the interest of a developer might not be necessarily in the interest of a community member. But it's important to have those conversations, because a lot of times there is middle ground and there is compromise to find, and working together to understand sort of what works for a developer and what's developer friendly, and what works for a community, and what will be coherent and good for the community. Those can sometimes you can sometimes find something that that checks all the boxes and that makes everybody happy. And that is that not only strengthens the comments that you have, if you can have sort of everyone have a hand in that and a filter on those comments through everybody's different lens. But it also looks better when you submit comments that have building experts and housing experts and environmental advocates and developers all sign on to the same comments and say, yeah, we approve of these comments. We think that these would improve the QAP. That is way more compelling to an HFA, and their ears perk up way more if you have all those different voices agreeing and signing on to the same comments versus just environmental advocates or just developers, as it can often be, because obviously you can already start to anticipate what environmental experts, what values they hold and what they might suggest. Same thing with developers, but if they can agree on some things, that's really compelling, and so sort of speaks to the importance of this step. The next step is to identify your goals. Pretty straightforward. What do you want to accomplish? And I sort of want to mention with this step is don't focus too much on details just yet. The reason this is step 2 is because you kind of just want to get on the same page about what are your broader goals? What do you want to accomplish in the short term? What do you want to accomplish in the long term? And I gave you some examples here. And I think, to give like just a very specific example, rather than saying, we'd like the QAP to include enterprise green communities, healthy building materials, specifically section 6.1 of the healthy building materials section. Like, you don't need to get that granular at this stage. I think it's just encourage healthy building materials, making sure that these developments are built with healthy building materials is one of our broad goals. And that's like, I think, as broad as you need to make it. And just like listing those out is what this step is about. And then prioritize them in the level of importance. So saying, hey, is making sure that these housing developments are connected with sidewalks and bike lanes, is that necessarily as important to us as electrifying and decarbonizing them? Maybe not. So maybe we'll just reorder these, not only so that you have an understanding of what are your top line items, but also so that when an HFA is looking through your eventual formal comments, they can say, okay, maybe an HFA often will only accept, it's very rare that HFA accepts everything. So if they're willing to accept a few things, you want them to grab your most important things, right? You want them to look at your top line items first. So that hierarchy of preferability is a part of this step as well. Step 3 is sort of it seems intuitive, but it's not necessarily. So personally reaching out to your HFA, getting in touch so that you have an understanding regarding the upcoming commenting period, but also just establishing a relationship, making sure that they know that you're submitting comments and what your intentions are. And a lot of times they'll share with you, here's what we're trying to do at the HFA. Here's some of the changes that we might be making. And, gaining insight into their drafted changes. So if they've made some changes from one QAP to the other, what are they trying to do? Why did they make some of those changes? And what direction are they trying to go? That can help inform your comments as well. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention here, in terms of getting in touch with your HFA is, as the federal law that I mentioned earlier states, a QAP has to include the HFA's priorities and clearly state them, but those priorities can be clearly stated through their structure, or they can argue that, yeah, our priorities are clearly stated based on the incentives and requirements that are included and not necessarily explicitly listing them. So they can be more implied and be made clear that way. So getting, absolutely clear if they're not explicitly stated by reaching out to the HFA and say, hey, what are you guys trying to do? What are you interested in? How do you want to improve the QAP this year? That can be super helpful. It can sometimes teach you a few things. As we all know from interpersonal relationships, you can sometimes get some information that's not necessarily publicly available, but when folks talk, you can gain a little bit more knowledge than you had before. And so folks will sometimes ask me, who specifically am I reaching out to at the HFA? And my top recommendation is go on their website, see if they have a staff member that oversees sustainability is often what they call it. They'll say that there's a staff member that has to do with sustainability or sometimes energy efficiency, as that is one of their requirements, one of the 10 requirements nationally that they address. If there's not, and some states don't have a sustainability or energy efficiency person per se, a mutual contact is, I think, the next best option. So if anyone in your coalition has a contact at the HFA, use that. Draw on existing relationships because they already know that person. There's probably already some trust that's built there, and that's a good connection to reinforce or take advantage of in a good way. And developers often have their own contacts. Usually if you, like I already recommended, have a developer in your coalition, and that developer probably has somebody that they're in contact with already. And if all else fails, the website will have somebody that you can reach out to. And I suggest taking advantage of that because that relationship can be, in some cases, very fruitful in terms of the information that you can get, and I'll kind of outline some reasons why here in a second. But then this map here, I just wanted to point this out. This has the decade of establishment of each HFA in each state. And as you can see, for the 8 Midwestern states, they all predate that the Tax Act that of 1986 that I outlined earlier. So they've all been around for a while. Illinois and Missouri and Michigan in the 1960s, the rest in the 1970s, with the exception of Ohio in the 1980s. So they've been around for a while. They've been doing this for a while, and connecting with them, as long as the relationship lasts, is a good idea. So step 4 is a very important part, and perhaps the more tedious and less fun part, but important nonetheless. Reviewing the last established QAP gives you an idea of the current operating standards and incentives that already exist, that are already part of the criteria, because developments have been, ever since the 80s, have been going up in communities and understanding what standards they're operating with and what incentives they have that they're using right now is sort of the first thing that you've got to make sure that you concern yourself with, especially because you can then take note of how your goals, where they fall on your goals. So if one of your goals is like I made an example of earlier, if one of your goals is healthy building materials, go to their section on healthy building materials and see, do they have incentives? Do they have requirements? Some of those things to see kind of where your current QAP falls in your goals. And that gives you an idea of where your starting place is, right? The next part of this is review the new draft QAP to look for changes proposed by the HFA. So again, if the HFA releases a changes document that outlines those changes that have been made from the last QAP to the new draft one, that is very helpful. It's something you might want to double check, but if not, it's up to you to go through and determine what's changed. Some states, they just put out a draft QAP, and they might redline it or something that shows the changes, but sometimes it's just a new QAP, and it's just up to you to determine what's different. And that can sound daunting, but all you really have to do is go through the last QAP, see where your goals fall, and then find the same place in the new draft QAP and see if anything's different. Physically look, is language different? Are they doing anything differently? But a lot of HFAs will try and help out in terms of, either having redlining and showing like, this is what's different now, or submit or putting out a changes document. The other thing that's important to do here is, once you figure out what the changes are, decide if you approve. Do you like that change? If you do, because the HFA might have done something that you like already that you don't even have to comment on. Maybe they took care of one of your goals already and some of your work is done, ideally. But if that's the case, a lot of times, and I'll get into this a little bit later, starting your comments by saying, hey, these are some of the things that we want to accomplish. These are our priorities, and you already took care of one of those. Thank you very much for doing this. Here are the rest of our recommendations. That's a really good way to like sort of get off on the right foot with an HFA and start your formal comments by saying, you guys are doing some great stuff and we'd like you to keep doing some great stuff. And so, that's something to take note of. If some of the changes you approve of, if there are changes that you don't approve of and you're like, hey, you're going in the wrong direction, decide if those changes warrant inclusion in your comments. Maybe you've got 5 goals that you outlined already, but then they just made this change and you're like, I really hate that. I guess we've got 6 goals now. That's something to take into account as well. And then the last thing that I wanted to bring up, and this is like a little bit more nuanced, but that's what we're here for, right? Take note of the number of changes that they have and the magnitude of those changes. So for instance, if say a new draft QAP has been released and there are not that many changes and it's just little language things, little words are changed here and there, maybe that HFA isn't trying to change too much, and that can sometimes signal to you, hey, they're not really interested. They don't really have the attitude to change very much. Maybe we should limit our comments to just like the most important things, because they don't have, they're clearly not trying to do too much this time around. Conversely, maybe there are a ton of changes, and maybe like Michigan, they've got that racial equity impact assessment going on, and they're like, we really want to make some, take some leaps and bounds with the progress of this QAP. That can signal to you, hey, they've got an appetite for some changes. Let's really get after it with our comments and be a little bit more ambitious. So noting the number and the magnitude of those changes can be very informative to your process as well. Step 5 is it rivals step 1 in terms of how important it is, because strategy can be crucial to, this is sort of the packaging, and this is sort of your positioning around some of your recommendations, because a lot of folks can have the same recommendations, but depending on how you present them can make a big difference. So the questions that you're asking when you are developing a strategy are, what's going to have the greatest impact and what accomplishes your goal in an acceptable amount of time? So considering that, let's say that because we're all here as a part of the wonderful Midwest Building Decarb Coalition's work, that you're interested in decarbonization and nothing else. Obviously, decarbonization is not going to happen overnight. And so breaking up that long-term goal into shorter-term goals and determining sort of what's acceptable, what are the acceptable steps to take. And I know I've got some environmentalist friends out there that would say the acceptable time frame is right now. But some of these policy things happen more gradually, for better or for worse. And in some cases that's understandable, because developers that are developing these housing projects, they have to acclimate to whatever changes in criteria that, if you're like, if you want to implement some of these changes, whatever they are, the developers have to make those adjustments. And so sometimes, making things a little bit more gradual can facilitate some of those, facilitate that transition, I should say. So here's some tactics, and I wanted to get very specific. And so when you read the main guide for the toolkit, I outline these with a much greater degree of detail, but I'll just list them here and I'll kind of explain. So number one is for the tactics is use active language. So this is related to the recommendation itself. So when you list the recommendation, and I've actually, I pulled up one of my documents here. So active language, I always tell people use a present tense verb to start your recommendation. So create a fourth building certification tier, or require that rehabilitation projects undergo a energy assessment. Starting with a verb, a present tense verb, very clearly indicates the action that you want the HFA to take. And if you think about the converse, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you have a recommendation that's like, we'd like you to reconsider how you assess the energy in buildings under certain and you know, an HFA, if they're feeling a little bit more ornery, they might say, yeah, we reconsidered, we check, we reconsidered just like you recommended that we do. Like, no. When you say, hey, create a fourth building tier, that is an active directive that they can either create that fourth building tier or not, but it's something that they do or do not do. And so being active rather than passive and starting with a verb is my first recommendation as far as tactics. Aim for gradual improvements, and I kind of touched on this already, that progress is gradual, sometimes more than we would like it to be, but you know, 2 steps forward is better than none, or 1 step forward is maybe not as good as 2, but it's better than none. So, and it's certainly better than a step backward. But there are 3 sort of components that of QAP that these are kind of like the technical language. So I'm starting to kind of dip my toes, and hopefully you're all following me here. But thresholds, competitive points, and set-asides. Those are 3 kind of jargony terms, and I'm gonna define them for you so you understand why they're here. Thresholds are requirements. So a threshold is something that every project has to do. If you are a low-income housing project and you want federal dollars, and this is a threshold, you have to meet that threshold. Competitive points are usually there's either a standard or a feature of the house. So say healthy building materials or a building certification, or if they do an energy assessment, those can be incentivized with points. And so you'll see this a lot on QAPs where there's a point system that's it can work in 2 ways. One is it can say, okay, you qualify for these federal dollars if you hit your 10 points. And it doesn't matter how you hit your 10 points, but here are all the things that are, here's a list of things that we'd like you to do. Here's the point values that are ascribed to each of them. And you hit your 10 points and then you qualify. The other way that it can happen is you can say, here's the features that the standards and features that you can implement, and here are the points that are ascribed to those. And the more points that you get, the more funding you're eligible for, right? So maybe there's 100 points that are available, and they say the closer you get to 100, the more funding you're available to. So it not only competitive points can not only be used as a tool to determine eligibility for funds, but they can also determine the amount, the quantity of funds that folks are eligible for. And then finally, set-asides. Set-asides are just like they sound. It's some of those funding dollars can be set aside for specific types of projects. A lot of times you'll see this. There'll be set-asides for specific populations, tribes, folks that are housing insecure. If a project, and these can be great when properly implemented. If you have a building that is a low-income housing building that is meant for housing folks that are housing insecure and to help people get off the street, I absolutely want some money set aside that, you know, can't otherwise be infringed upon, that is just for that purpose, right? And so what I often tell people is the reason that this is related to gradual improvements is because a lot of times when you make a recommendation, if something's not included in the QAP, starting by saying, hey, can you incentivize this thing with 1 or 2 competitive points or a low amount of competitive points, that's usually the first best entryway into inclusion in the QAP. Versus if you want to start out by saying, we'd like a chunk of money as a set aside for this specific thing, a lot of times that's not how it happens. A lot of times you'll do competitive points. And so it starts with something that's incentivized, and then it moves to being a threshold where, okay, now it's not incentivized, it's required. And then eventually, sometimes what can happen is then it can move from being a threshold to being a set aside, where it's like, we require all projects to do this. And every year we have a dozen projects that go for this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to set aside some money so that we're never cutting anybody out of that, because it's become such a need in our community, and clearly something that that deserves a certain amount of our funding dollars. And so that's kind of gives you a snapshot of sort of how you can build these gradual improvements, and gives you an idea of when you're making these recommendations, not jumping from, you know, you're using active language, you're saying, hey, require if you're saying, hey, require a energy assessment, maybe you look at the past QAP and the draft QAP, and energy assessments aren't in there. So maybe say, hey, whoa, maybe we shouldn't say require, we shouldn't make that a threshold, we should make that competitive points first, and then we can build towards making that a requirement. So yeah, that was kind of a tangent, but that's a very important part of the strategy that goes into this. Third bullet there, explain your reasoning. So once you've got sort of your active language and you've got your recommendations that are making gradual improvements and they're aligned with your goals, the next obvious part is after your recommendation, include a little paragraph that explains why you think they should do that. You know, don't just say, hey, do this, and then give no reasons for it. You've got to sort of state your case. So that should be pretty self-explanatory. And then underneath the explanation, what I always tell folks to do is use examples from other states. So if another state has done this already, that is huge. That's hugely helpful, because number one, you can include that and say, hey, look to your HFA. Someone else did this already. Someone else suggested this. They're doing this. This is a realistic thing that is already happening, that someone already thought was a good idea, and that the HFA agreed. And so that makes a hugely compelling case. Furthermore, not only does that show them that it's realistic, they can then model their policy off of that other state. They can say, oh, Ohio does this. Well, let's look at Ohio's QAP and see how they did it. Maybe we want to do it. Maybe we want to do it the same way and just model our provision from theirs. Or maybe we want to do it a little bit differently. But now we've got something that we can go off of, rather than just, can you create this thing that, you know, they might not otherwise know if it exists in the world. And so when you go through those are two kind of daunting steps. I know, like explaining your reasoning can sometimes be tough, because you're like, you know, how am I to explain it besides like, I think this is the right thing to do, or how do I know like what other states are doing? And if you go through the guide, the QAP Commenting Toolkit, the main guide that I've created, that you'll all get a chance to see. I'm just presenting on it right now, but the actual guide's got, I've included resources where there are websites that there are whole other resources that just list out other states that have done energy efficient and decarbonization recommendations. And so you can just pull from those resources like, hey, we want you to do this thing. And then you can go through that guide. Oh, look, Ohio did it, Pennsylvania did it, you know, what have you. And then there are also resources for explaining your reasoning. And I've included some resources that if you're not familiar with like sort of how to construct that argument, that will sort of explain like what sort of language is preferable, what works with the HFA, how to explain that it's developer friendly, because a lot of HFAs want to make sure that if they're making a change that developers can actually, it's something that they can do and that they won't be horribly angry with, and ideally that they're okay with. And then finally, my last tactic here is narrow your recommendations. So I'll get this a lot where folks are like, yeah, we've made our list of recommendations. We've got 24 recommendations. We got a couple dozen recommendations that we'd like. We want all these changes. And I'm always like, that's a great thing to hear, because yeah, there's a lot of housing policy that needs a lot of change. We need a lot of change in this world. But what I often tell people is, imagine that you are delivering these comments orally, verbally, and imagine how daunting it would be and how ineffective it would be if you just rattled off a list of 20 some odd recommendations. And HFA, eventually they're just gonna, like, it's a lot. And these HFAs are also fielding like sometimes hundreds of comments. And so to have a couple dozen in your comments can sometimes it can really dilute the power of some of your recommendations. So what I often tell people is, pick your favorite 3 to 5, maybe 3 to 6. And sometimes I'll get people that are like, that's not enough. And I'm like, okay, but listen, here, let me make 2 more arguments to you, and then I'll leave this alone. Number 1, if you submit 1 recommendation and that 1 recommendation is accepted, that is you are more effective than if you submit all 24 of your recommendations and none of them get accepted, right? And then the second thing that I always say too is, like I said already, this process happens every year or every other year. So you can submit submit a few comments, like see if you can get some of them accepted, and I know you will, especially using this toolkit. And then work your way down your list. Start with your most important ones. Submit those 3 to 5. You get a couple accepted, and then you get to include some more from your list, and keep working at it, and keep improving that QAP. So those are my tactics. So I'll move on. Step 6 is very user-friendly, and I've tried to make this as user-friendly as possible. So another component of this toolkit is a comment template. So I've put together this comment template where here's a screenshot of it. It's 1 page, so that it's very easy to use. All the information that you need to plug in is highlighted and italicized. So you should be able to see, how to even start the address, what information needs to be plugged in. As you can see, sort of in that first paragraph, we commend the HFA for their commitment, and you can list provisions that QAP provisions that you approve of, and explain why. Why do you approve of those? Because remember this, if it's a provision that's new, that's part of the draft QAP, that's not in there yet. So saying, hey, we want you to keep this, and here's why, because there might be people out there that are saying, we don't want you to keep this. So not only do you want to say, hey, this is what we like, thank you, but you also want to say, you should keep it, and make a better argument than people that might be saying the opposite. And then, as you continue, we'll get into a couple of these components a little bit later, but your first recommendation, your explanation, and then those case studies are where you can demonstrate that other states have done the same thing. And then finally finishing with the name, position, organization, and email, which is just referred to as a signature of all of your coalition members. So this comment template is a Word document that is a part of this toolkit and is available to all of you as part of this toolkit to make it easy on folks who want to submit their own comments. So really happy to have that included. And then what might seem as last, but it's second to last actually, is submitting your comments. Really straightforward. each state has their own process for receiving comments, but the most common one is it'll just say on their website, and this is, I've got an example here on the right from Minnesota. Just email your comments directly to, and they give an email address, and that is what you'll see, 9 times out of 10. It's just an easy way for them. Usually they've set up a specific email address that is just for fielding comments, because there can sometimes be a lot. The method and recipient is usually on their website. So this is an example from our comments in Minnesota. Basically just attention, please see the attached comments on behalf of, listed everybody that signed on. Simple as that. And then the last step, step 8, analyze the final QAP. So once the HFA gets all the comments and they discuss them, deliberate them, I'm sure very thoroughly, I hope, they will decide what they're going to incorporate and how, because sometimes they might say, oh yeah, we like your idea about energy assessments or healthy building materials, but we're going to do it a little bit differently than you suggested. But that's still good. I mean, it's better than nothing sometimes, or often, I should say. So then it's your job to go through and determine what they accepted and in what way they accepted it. As you can see on the right here, I've got a picture of a changes document to give you an idea of what that looks like. It's got the section, the suggestion that comes from folks' comments, and then their response, and it'll show either made change, or the response also includes how they made the change sometimes. If it's just require architectural schematics or something like that, that's good active language, by the way. They'll just say, we made that change. Or if they did it in a certain way, they'll explain how. So that comment changes document can be very helpful. But again, that's not legally required of an HFA. So they might just make changes and put out the final version of the QAP, and it's up to everybody else to figure out what changed and how. And so what I usually do is I pull up the comments that I submitted, and it's a very simple process. All you do is you go through in your comments, and I say, okay, line 1, we wanted to promote electrification, or you wouldn't say promote electrification because you use more active language than that. You'd say require electric readiness in new construction buildings. And so then I would go to the appropriate section in the QAP and see if they did that, and see if there are any changes from, now you're looking for changes from the draft QAP to the final. And I usually use highlighters. Pick your favorite color. If they accepted it, highlight it in your favorite color. If they accept it but only partially, pick your second favorite color, or a less bright version of that first one, whichever you prefer. And then finally, if they didn't accept that comment, I usually highlight it in gray, or you can bold it however you want to indicate that that wasn't accepted, and you can keep that in mind, because inevitably it's very rare that they accept everything, so don't take that personally. And the other thing to take note of is that HFAs, they may not adopt recommendations for a variety of reasons. And so having that relationship with the HFA to say, hey, we noticed that you didn't accept any of our comments, or you accepted very few of them, and we were kind of wondering why. You can sometimes get some feedback as to why, because maybe they say, hey, that recommendation that you made, it wasn't particularly developer friendly, or we've got some feedback from developers that said that method wasn't cost effective. And so then you can sometimes go back to your coalition, especially if there are developers in your coalition, which hopefully there are, and you can say, hey, how do we make this more developer friendly? How do we submit sort of the same comment, but we package it in a way that is more implementable or is more cost effective? And it's a good way of, rather than just beating your head against the wall and saying, why don't they accept this comment? You've established a relationship with your HFA, and you've gotten feedback from them that says, this is why, and then you can fix it and resubmit. Sometimes to sometimes they'll have a second round of comments, and you can sometimes resubmit that comment in a more effective way. And I'm about to get into that here in a second. So thank you folks for hanging with me. This is the last slide, the last material part of this presentation is the tips and tricks. These are just sort of lesser known or less conventional components of this process that folks might not know about. So this is kind of my like sneaky insider information for folks that, you know, don't sometimes know about this without the experience. So number one is sign up for HFA notification emails. If you're anything like me, you're like, boy, do I need more, just what I need, some more emails in my inbox. But it can really be helpful. For instance, that Michigan racial equity assessment, impact assessment, I only knew about that because I'm signed up for their email notifications, and they sent an email that said, hey, we're thinking about doing this separate assessment that has to do with the QAP. A lot of times they'll send an email that say, hey, we've got a QAP commenting period that's coming up, and that can sort of like, they'll give you a date even to expect the QAP. Or, you know, if there's any changes along the way, those notification emails can be hugely helpful. So I always tell people, subscribe to those. I know that, you know, sometimes you might get some that aren't relevant, but the ones that are, make it all worth it. Submit pre-draft and second round comments. Like I mentioned before, some QAP comment periods have a second round. So a lot of times you aren't going to want to just submit the same comments that you did before because they've already either accepted or rejected those. And so they'll probably do the same thing on the same grounds. But, you know, for instance, in Minnesota, we submitted, I think, 6 comments and 6 recommendations, and they accepted one of our big ones, which was very exciting, but then it had to do with creating a 4th tier of building certifications. But then we really wanted to emphasize promoting electrification. And so our second round of comments, we did submit a second round of comments, and we basically just said, hey, thank you for taking a look at our first round of comments. For our second round, we really just think you should take another look at electrification and promoting decarbonization. And because, you know, that's sort of the way things are going. It's the way of the future. It affects health and affordability and the climate. It affects all these different components of the way we work and live. And we'd really just like you to take a look at that one recommendation again. Another component of this is you can submit pre-draft comments. And this is the one that I sometimes get questions on because folks are like, well, what do you mean? You submit comments before the draft is released? And the answer is yes. And this is where the HFA, the relationship with the HFA can be very important because they sometimes are looking for changes to make to that draft QAP. So they come out with a draft QAP, and the way that I've been talking about it so far is that we're being very reactive to that draft QAP. Well, you can be a little bit proactive sometimes, and you can reach out to your HFA person and say, hey, we've got some changes that you could maybe incorporate into that draft QAP if you'd like. And sometimes that can be like kind of a sneaky, helpful way for both parties. It's helpful to you because you might get your foot in the door and get some of your changes onto that draft QAP and, you know, get it that much closer to being incorporated. On the other hand, for the HFA person, they get to implement a change, but they also are putting it just on a draft QAP. So by putting it on the draft, they're inherently submitting it for feedback to everybody else for their regular commenting period. So it's a way for them to like test something out to say like, okay, here's a change that Midwest Building Decarb Coalition wants to make, but we don't know how we feel about it, or we don't know how developers might feel about it, some of the developers that they're not already working with. So we'll put it on the draft QAP and we'll see if there's feedback about it. And so it can be really helpful if you can submit those pre-draft comments, and you might not always be able to. That's not something that HFAs are always receptive to, but if you have that relationship with them, it's a good way to say, hey, are you receptive to this? You know, that can be a very effective, like less conventional method here. Work with developers. I already kind of mentioned this in a number of different points, but you know, ensuring that you're sort of working with I call it sort of the other side of the aisle, or the, making your comments bipartisan in terms of, we want these developments to be made to the highest standard and the highest quality possible, as we should. But there are also costs, and, making sure that they can build these things with the amount of money that they have. And, there are constraints on the developer side that a lot of us don't even know too much about. So having them included is a good way to be conscious and conscientious of those things. And also, like I said before, makes your comments more compelling if they're agreeable to both sides. Second to last here is include state laws and policies that align with your recommendations. So I've got an example here on the right of Minnesota housing. When we submitted those comments, it was in the wake of two things. One was Minnesota had released a climate action plan where they said, hey, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we, as part of our comments, said, that's great, Minnesota. Or we're speaking to the HFA. So we said, Minnesota did this great thing. They submitted this climate action plan where they want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Do you know what accounts for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions? The housing sector. And so then we say, do you know what part of the housing sector emits the most emissions? Underinvested low-income housing oftentimes. So this is a way that you can accomplish some of your state goals in other departments. And so that's like a really compelling way to make your argument. And I mentioned two things. The other thing is that they also had a study that talked about the energy burden of folks in Minnesota, and that energy affordability is becoming increasingly prescient in our day and age, especially with inflation. I mean, talk to anybody about how their energy bills are lately. Like, they're high, they're expensive, and they're only getting more expensive, and it's really annoying. It's at the very least very annoying, if not a serious financial concern for a lot of people, especially lower income folks or folks with lower incomes. And so citing some of those sources and saying that, hey, you can address multiple problems with the solution that we're recommending. I mean, that is, now you're talking about top quality, top tier comments and recommendations. And then finally, when properties are awarded these tax credits, there's usually a list, and that's publicly provided on the HFA's website. And they're also legally required to send that list to the executive authority in the jurisdiction. So usually that's the mayor or a county executive. And you can also get in touch with that person, if not check the list on your own. And that's a really good way of doing your due diligence once again and saying, who's going after these tax credits? What developments are going up? Where are they going up? Are they going to integrate with that community in a good way? How did they comply with the existing QAP? Sort of, if you've got like a point system, where did they get points? You can sometimes find out some of that information on the back end. And I'll just give you a little anecdote just to give you like a concrete example. So I'm here in Chicago, and the Chicago's got its own QAP, and it's got, as part of the QAP, Chicago has a sustainable development policy, SDP, sustainable development policy. And that basically has a list of things that you can do and the points that are, and point values for each of them. And listed in the sustainable development policy is green building certifications, energy efficiency and energy conservation, decarbonization, all these great things. Also listed places to store a bike, ways that you can make sure that birds don't run into your building. And don't get me wrong, those are important things, and they have to do with the environment, right? I'm all for bike racks, and I'm all for I am totally for making sure that our wildlife are protected. But if someone is getting points, if someone's checking the sustainable development points by installing a bike rack versus making the building, doing something that would improve the energy affordability or the air quality of that building, those aren't quite on the same scale, right? So that can sometimes inform you like, oh, hey, people are checking the sustainable box, but for reasons that maybe should be weighted differently, right? So that's another way that you can sort of hold some of these properties accountable to make sure that, I mean, think about it this way: developers are just trying to get their project up and going, and there's nothing wrong with that, because none of this, as we talked about before, we all want there to be more housing. That leads to more affordable housing, more affordable when there's a greater supply of it. So we're all on the same team in terms of, we all want these housing developments to go up, but in that process, if they're checking boxes and they're doing it as easily as possible, as is sort of their incentive, we also got to make sure that the boxes that they can check are the right ones or are weighted in the right way. And so with that, I just want to conclude. If you're still with me, I can't thank you enough for listening to me yap at you for this long. But the last thing that I want to say here is part of my conclusion, and then I can take some questions and comments before you all have to go. But I just want to say, housing, especially low-income housing, is substandard or falls into being substandard or in disrepair way too often. Everyone deserves housing that is safe, healthy, efficient, and affordable. And this is just coming from me personally. I just believe that everyone deserves a place to live. They deserve that place to live to be somewhere that they can afford, somewhere that is safe for them to live, somewhere that is healthy for them to live, and is efficient, which, contributes to all of those other qualities. The QAP and housing policy in general is one way that we can ensure that people live with that kind of quality housing. And here's my other pitch. Even if you don't believe those things, and I come from downstate Illinois, so like, the cornfields, sometimes they don't agree with all of that. But even if you don't, here's my second argument. Our tax dollars subsidize these projects. So we should have a say in how those tax dollars are allocated, right? Anything that comes out of your pocket in terms of taxes, you should have a say, whether in democratic representation or in direct action like this. You should have a say in how those dollars are allocated. And this is one way that you can have a direct impact in that. And one of the things that's on Midwest Building Decarb's Decarbonization Coalition's website that I absolutely love, and I wanted to make sure that I included it both in the guide and in this presentation. They said on their website, the energy transition is inevitable, but justice is not. So the energy transition is happening. We are going to electrify. Fossil fuels are inherently finite. They are non-renewable. Energy transition will happen, but whether or not it happens in a just way is up to us. And so I really appreciate all of your time. I really appreciate all of you caring enough to listen to me for this long. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to stay on for as long as you need for me to take them. And